Agava mu ggwanga United States of America si birungi eri gavumenti ya Mwami Museveni. Generali Museveni ebibi gakaba gakomba kubanga omusango Kyagulanyi gwe yateeka mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ICC ogw'okutulugunya abantu n'okukola ebikolobero ku bannayuganda ICC neyagukkiriza. Olwaleero bannamateeka abalala babiri beegasse ku musango guno mu ggwanga lya America era nga bano omulimu gwabwe bagenda kupoloota gavumenti ya America ekuli omukulu Biden okwongera okulaba nti bongera sanctions empitirivu ku ggwanga lya Uganda nadda okusingira ddala Mwami Museveni nga kye baagala nti bagenda kutwala obujulizi bwonna obukakafu bwe balina nga bo bannamateeka nti batambulira ku bukakafu na bujulizi era bagenda kubukwata obujulizi buno ng'omusango bwe guli mu kkooti y'ensi yonna byonna babitwale mu yafeesi ya Joe Biden babimulage era bamutabbire bamuliiremu ebigambo nti okolagana n'omuntu omukyamu okolagana n'omuntu omutemu okolagana n'omuntu atasaana kulaganika naye aswaza ekitiibwa ky'eggwanga lya America nti bo bakooye okubanga America eswala buli budde ng'ensimbi z'omuwi w'omusolo w'eggwanga lya America zidiibuudibwa ziweebwa abantu ate batagoberera ssemateeka oba abatalina demokrasiya mu nsi zaabwe. Abantu bakozesa ensimbi za America ate okutulugunya abantu bannayuganda be balina okukuuma nti ensimbi zino America eziwaayo okungera okusitula omutindo gw'embeera z'abantu bannayuganda naye ate ensimbi zino Mwami Museveni azikozesa kuggyawo obulamu bwa bannayuganda. Bigambo bya bannamateeka abazungu abalala abakyala babiri abeegasse ku Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine beegasse ku National Unity Platform beegasse ku People Power nga baagala kulwanirira ddembe lya munnayuganda okulaba nga Uganda efuna obukulembeze obulungi. Bagamba babadde balumwa nga bibaluma bibasiiwa bibatujja omutima olw'okuba nti Uganda eri mu kubonaabona bannayuganda bali mu kubuzibwa bali mu kuwambibwa buli olukedde bannayuganda bali mu kuttibwa bali mu kutulugunyizibwa nga naye tewali kikolebwa kwe kusalawo nga bo nti tebalina kyakuwa bannayuganda kirala okuggyako okuwaayo omulimu gwe baasoma ogw'amateeka n'okwongera okulungamya oba okulambika eggwanga lya America ku butya bwelina okulagana ne Mwami Museveni oba ne Uganda so si kumuwa buwi nsimbi ate azikozesa okutyoboola eddembe ly'obuntu. Bano bagamba nti baagala Mwami Museveni ng'alagiddwa akwatibwe oba ng'akwatiddwa abitebye ebyo byazze akola ku bannayuganda nti bannayuganda bajja okufuna eddembe bajja okufuna essanyu. Bino nno byonna bye nkugamba biri wali mu diaspora NUP convention 2023 Washington DC. Bano bazze ne beetaba ku mukolo guno ogw'abannayuganda free of charge nga bannakyewa era nga baagala beegatte wamu ne munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine eyatwala omusango omunene omusango kasiggwe gufuuse kanaaluzaala mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ogwa Mwami Museveni ne mutabani we n'abantu abalala mu gavumenti ya Uganda abakoze ebikolobero eby'enjawulo ku bannayuganda. Omusango guno gwakkirizibwa era abajulizi 2015 Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine be yawaayo. Kati kkooti y'ensi yonna ekyekennenya bujulizi buno era nga mu kaseera katono Kyagulanyi yatutegeezezza nti mugenda kulaba Mwami Museveni nga bamukwata jjeeke. Bano nno abazungu kye kibaleese baagala yanguweko tebaagala birwewo kuba nti kkooti y'ensi yonna bagimanyi etwala obudde buwanvu. Kati bo baagala bajanguyize buli kimu bakiteeke ku mmeeza buli kimu bakyanguyeyanguyeko nga bwe bapika n'omuliro mu Joe Biden kubanga enkola ze ez'ebintu bazimanyi okulaba nga Uganda efuna eddembe era nga Mwami Museveni bamukwata jjeeke. Lwaki mbikumalirayo? Kkiriza nkutwale wali mu ggwanga lya America Washington DC ku mukolo ogw'okugatta bannayuganda convention ay'okugatta bannayuganda abanankyukakyuka aba People Power NUP mu Washington DC ne Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine n'abazungu bano abakyala abeegasse ku struggle nga bagamba baaga kulaba nga Mwami Museveni avudde mu entebe Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine gye yawangula 2014 January.
So, hello everyone. So, my name is Andrea Barron. I'm the Advocacy Program Manager at TASS, the Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Coalition. It's a long name. And we just call it the Torture Abolition Coalition. And we're going to divide our presentation into 3 parts. I'm going to speak for 5 or 6 minutes about TASS and our mission. And then Joanne is going to speak for around 15 minutes about our report on torture in Uganda. And then I'm going to talk about U.S. policy on Uganda, focusing more on Congress and what I see as a way to press the Biden administration and Congress to move beyond rhetorical condemnation of the Museveni regime. You all might not like my ideas, but I'm going to tell you what they are. Okay, so TASS was founded in 1998 by Sister Diana Ortiz, an Ursuline nun who was tortured and raped by the Guatemalan military in 1989 at a time when the US supported the country's right-wing military dictatorship. So Uganda is not the only dictatorship that the United States has supported in its history. TASS mission is to end the practice of torture wherever it occurs and empower survivors, their families, and communities. Just like we heard Bobby Wine say that he's a survivor, not a victim, we call our survivors. We don't say they're victims, they're survivors. Our TASS provides a variety of direct services to survivors in the DC area: free legal aid, social services, mental health support, and career development. Over 95% are from Africa. Most were persecuted because they were political activists in their country. Our legal department has 2 immigration attorneys and a paralegal with expertise in asylum law. The overwhelming majority of our survivors are affirmative asylum seekers, and we have a small number of defensive cases. Social services help survivors build on their strengths to develop a path to reach their goals, including their career objectives. The mental health program helps them cope with multiple traumas and losses in a safe, caring, and confidential environment. I'm going to focus now on the advocacy program, which I lead. Because TASS was founded as an advocacy organization to combat torture, and because we're only 20 minutes away from the US Congress and the White House, we're located very close to Catholic University in DC Northeast. We're uniquely positioned to work with survivors in advocating for policies that matter to them. The advocacy program is national and also has some international components. So I work with both survivors in the DC area, and since the pandemic, we started working on Zoom with people all over the country, including a few Ugandans. Most of them are from New York, New Jersey, California, and Illinois. Is anybody here from Massachusetts? So that's my home state, Boston strong, woo! We use 3 criteria to decide what issues to work on. What policy issues do survivors care about? How can we have an impact? And what is our capacity to achieve a specific goal? During my first years at TASS, we concentrated on human rights abuses in the countries survivors are from, mostly Ethiopia, Cameroon, and Eritrea, a few from Sudan and Uganda. In the last 2 years, we've dedicated most of our time to our affirmative asylum justice campaign. Some of you might be aware there are thousands of asylum applicants, over 180,000, who are affirmative, which means they entered the US legally with visas, and they've waited as long as 7 years for an interview with US Citizenship and Immigration Services. Does anybody know about this? These are not the people who crossed the border. These are people who entered legally with visas and can't get an interview. People know about this? Okay, so if you have, this is apart from my regular speech, if you know anyone waiting more than 5 years for an interview, affirmative, they can email me at andrea@tass.org and let me know. I particularly need some people from Massachusetts because we cannot get Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey to get with us until I find some Massachusetts people. But wherever you're from, only waiting over more than 5 years, okay? Please. So, up until TASS launched our campaign in 2021, with partners in New York City and California, nobody paid attention to these people. They've suffered tremendously because of forced family separation, psychological trauma, fear of being sent back to their country. They have a well-founded fear of future persecution. They include torture survivors, rape victims, and persecuted members of the LGBT community. How does TASS advocacy work? We prepare survivors to meet with congressional aides in person or over Zoom to share their stories. Before the pandemic, we had about 70 congressional meetings a year. Of course, you all know these are not with actual members of Congress. They're with the aides, but the aides help make policy. So when you set up your meetings, don't feel badly if you can't meet with a representative of the senator. Most people don't. So now this year we only had 50 because of the pandemic, and next year hopefully we're back to 70. Our biggest success so far has been a letter on July 27th from 61 members of the House of Representatives sent to Urjadu, you never heard her name before. She is the director of USCIS, and Homeland Security Mayorkas. And what we're trying to do is move all affirmative asylum seekers waiting more than 5 years to the front of the line. That's what we want. Now, this doesn't mean, thank you, I'm glad, I wasn't sure how many people here follow that issue about affirmative asylum seekers, because I know a lot of you are immigrants and you've been here a while. This doesn't mean that USCIS has to listen to them, but it's a big deal when you have 61 members of Congress. So we're bragging because Amnesty International gets those kind of numbers on their letters. We're a tiny little organization. So the torture survivors, me, my interns, so we're very proud that we got these 61 names of people. Thank you. Because we work very, very hard. So, of course, now we're trying to get a similar letter on the Senate. Okay, so I think this is the part where I'm going to conclude my introduction to TASS. And now I'm going to introduce Joanne Gettert, who's going to speak about torture in Uganda. She was a volunteer at TASS, a volunteer lawyer, and she works much harder than many people paid for 40 hours a week. So let's thank Joanne.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I am so honored to be here. You know, those years that I was working, it was behind a desk with a computer screen in front of me, just sitting in my chair, working on these human rights issues in Africa, and especially Uganda. To be with you who have lived experiences that have seen the impacts of persecution and torture, whether it's personally or among family or friends or political colleagues. It's so meaningful for me to be here, and again, I really am honored. Now, my work at TASS first involved, as I think Andrea mentioned, representing dozens of torture survivors in the asylum office, in the immigration court, and we struggled together to get asylum for them. There's a terrible irony about TASS asylum seekers. On one hand, we're usually successful, but on the other hand, the reason we're successful is because our TASS members have typically suffered such terrible, horrendous persecution that their stories can't be denied. Now, my role was just to document their experience, put it in a good legal framework, and guide them through a very complicated legal administrative process. It was incredibly rewarding, okay, sure, to secure a life in the United States, one survivor at a time. But after a while, our then director, Leonce Bimiana, asked me to move on to an effort where success can make such a bigger difference, but where the risk of failure is also much bigger. And that is in attempting to hold perpetrators of torture and persecution accountable for their brutality. Now, when the successes happen, it's spectacular. They can be punished financially, publicly vilified, made pariahs, imprisoned. It would send a strong signal to others as well, and hopefully deter them. But why is the risk of failure so great? Frankly, it's because the tools that we have in the United States for holding these individuals accountable are totally inadequate. One of them is the Torture Victim Protection Act. On paper, it looks great. A survivor of torture in the United States can sue in federal court against the perpetrator. But those victories, when they happen, are hollow, because unless that perpetrator has ties to the United States, and even more importantly, assets in the United States that can be taken to pay damages, it doesn't really amount to much. TASS, we tried to identify some of these perpetrators. We certainly had any number of torture survivors who could have been plaintiffs in those cases, but we just couldn't find the perpetrators that had the assets in the United States. So that really didn't work for us, and frankly, it rarely works for others. Second, cases can be brought to the International Criminal Court, and I'm not going to talk about this because we have a man here, Bruce Afran, who has done work that I admire beyond measure. You know, we lawyers, we talk about evidence and we talk about argument, and this is the strongest evidence and the most powerful legal argument that could possibly be mounted. And all I can do is hope and pray that there is success in the end. Finally, there's the use of global Magnitsky sanctions against persecutors, And here is where TASS has made very, very concerted efforts over a number of years, and Andrea and I have personally worked very hard to build strong cases. Now, for reasons I'll explain, we can't talk about the specifics of our work, but this much I can say. We've submitted voluminous and I think ironclad evidence of the kind of serious human rights violations that the Global Magnitsky Act is supposed to correct. And we've submitted them, by the way, not just to the US State Department, but also to the sanctions enforcement agencies in the United Kingdom and the European Union. If all three of those governments agree to sanction, it can be the most powerful deterrent. Does it ever happen? Very rarely. Now, when a human rights group like TASS does submit a sanctions petition, it's not like a court case where there's a public record. We submit, and we have no idea what happens to it. It goes to the State Department, and they do their work, and we never hear back from them. And we look every week to see if one of our perpetrators has been sanctioned. Now that confidentiality is frustrating, but it makes good sense because you obviously don't want to tip off a perpetrator, tell them, hey, we're going after you, so they can then take their assets out of the United States and move them to their home country or Russia or China or somewhere where human rights violations are just fine. And also, and it's even more, we need to protect the safety of the brave individuals who gave evidence to us and came forward with their experiences. What this means is we never know the outcome of our cases. In Uganda, I'm going to be careful here, we know, for example, that Abel Kandiho was sanctioned a little over a year ago, I think. Whether or how or TASS may or may not have played a role in that, we will never know. Now, it's interesting because the United States and the United Kingdom and the European Union, especially around the 2021 elections, have all come out and made statements condemning the human rights abuses that occurred around that election. But sanctions have not happened, except, I guess, in the one instance that I just mentioned. Now, Andrea's insights into US foreign and military ties to Uganda, and others, I'm sure, who have spoken about those today with you or will later, give hints into why sanctions against Museveni's henchmen have not taken place, even when they should, if they were based genuinely on the human rights violations themselves. So how can we, at least at TASS, hold perpetrators accountable, given that there are few legal avenues to do so? In the end, we looked to the court of public opinion, and that's the route that we took with all the evidence that we had, and the result was our comprehensive report, Torture in Uganda. The report first summarized the long, tragic history, over 50 years history, of the widespread use of torture by any number of Uganda's leaders. It describes the physical and psychological impact that the trauma of torture can have on its victims. And it counters directly the government argument that there are already avenues in Uganda for holding human rights violators accountable just within the system already. Then the real focus of the report was its absolutely unsparing, detailed account of the regime's brazen, and I mean brazen, use of torture to keep its hold on power since 2017. For this, we relied on many sources, the accounts of human rights organizations that are on the ground in Africa, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch in particular, the international press, and the BBC and Al Jazeera, I can say, have done a somewhat credible job. The US press has woefully fallen short. Public accounts by prominent Ugandans, members of parliament, candidates, authors. But most importantly, we relied on the information that we got from the people we call our brave citizen journalists. And they came to us as a result of, and the young people in this audience, I probably appreciate this more than I can, a secure online reporting platform that TASS established. And we used social media and word of mouth to get the information out. And the purpose of that was to collect information about torture and persecution in Uganda. And within 2 months, we received online reports of unlawful imprisonment, torture, other abuses from over 300 Ugandan citizens. 2 months, 300 reports. And what wasn't even a well-publicized avenue for reporting. And from those, we took the testimony of 22 of those reporters who were willing to sit down with us and patiently and courageously describe the most unimaginable experiences in anyone's life. So with this rich and tragic information, we did our report on what is the systematic, and I emphasize systematic, use of torture and other serious human rights abuses in Uganda. The first of those was police attacks at public events. Now, some of these are so well known, I don't have to talk about the details. The 2017 attacks on members of parliament resulted in the arrests and torture of Bobi Wine and others. The 2018 attacks at, before, and after a political rally in Arusha. The second set of systematic violations we found were attacks on journalists, especially intense persecution of journalists during and after the 2021 presidential campaign. 2 journalists were badly beaten just for reporting during the campaign. Many were kept away by force from public polling places on election day, and 20 were attacked, physically attacked by police, covering Bobi Wine's filing of a complaint at the Kampala UN office. 4 of them were hospitalized with serious injuries. And then the third and largest category that we looked at was police violence against ordinary citizens. And we looked at 2 groups, UDP and other opposition group activists and supporters, and gay and lesbian Ugandans. Now, hundreds had entered, as I said, these are their experiences in our online reporting system, and 20 of those their stories ended up in the report. About half of the individuals that we talked to and included in the report wanted their names to be in that report. They were willing to take the risk that in a public report, they could be exposed and then persecuted once again simply for working with us on the report. Another half, and typically those were individuals with families and children, perfectly legitimately asked that their words be anonymously reported, and we of course honored that. Now, I wish there was time to tell every one of their stories, and obviously there isn't, but these are ordinary citizens. They're just living their lives. They're just exercising the most simple rights that we in this country take for granted of speech and assembly and association. And everyone that talked to us was either arrested, detained, tortured, their families threatened, a few were even disappeared. And all they were doing was attending rallies, standing on a street corner wearing a pro-UDP t-shirt, walking home from work after spending a day working at the polls, or dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. And that's story after story after story. In the end, the report was published in mid-2021, submitted to the African Union Commission on Human Rights. Since then, it has on the TASS website been downloaded over 400 times and has been viewed more than 25,000 times. And if you haven't seen it, please take a look. Its results were widely reported in Uganda and in a number of other African countries and their press outlets. Sadly, it got very little coverage in the United States. Human rights abuses in Africa never get the attention that they deserve. But we also know, and this was especially important to me as an old asylum attorney, that asylum attorneys across the country would use this report as part of their evidence in the asylum cases that they brought forward for their Ugandan clients. They must include evidence in those evidence packets of such dangerous country conditions in the individual's home country that they could not return home safely. And our report certainly demonstrated that. And then finally, I'll just note that at the time of the report, after the report was published, the regime continues its autocratic hold on Uganda. With no election campaigns in the last year, it seems that those human rights abuses may have tamped down a little bit. Maybe it was the sanctions against Kandiho, maybe the pending ICC case has chastened Museveni and his henchmen. Perhaps it's just easing up and waiting for the next election campaign. And then just a few months ago, I was shocked that Museveni announced that his government was throwing out the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights from Uganda. And why? He said that, well, and I quote, "While there were some mistakes in handling people when they were being arrested, we corrected those mistakes." Does anyone in this room believe that statement? No, I certainly don't. But please, please know that there are those of us here in DC, especially Andrea and her colleagues at TASS, who will keep the faith with the Ugandan people. And I'll be with her all the way. And I fear, I've talked a lot about the limitations and kind of the bad news in how much we can accomplish in keeping perpetrators accountable. But we all obviously have to keep trying. We will, and I know all of you will too. Thank you so much for letting me take up a little bit of your time.
This is TASS Practice.
Department, in its human rights reports, documents these actions: intimidation of journalists, attacks against Museveni's political opponents, murder, corruption, criminalization of same-sex consensual sexual conduct. Year after year, this rhetorical condemnation continues. That means a lot of talk, right? My first experience with a torture survivor from Uganda was in 2019, when I helped set up meetings for Member of Parliament Betty Nambuz in the US Congress, and accompanied her on these visits. I had read about how she was attacked in Parliament in 2017 by Museveni's thugs, breaking her back. I walked with her through the tunnels in Congress, in meetings with 2 members of Congress. It reminded me of when I used to escort my 80-year-old mother, who just had a few minor aches. Betty was suffering tremendously, but she never complained, not even once. But at the same time we read these State Department human rights reports, we kept hearing about how the US did not want to alienate Museveni because Uganda boasts the largest number of refugees in Africa, now 1.5 million, and of course because of its contribution to the African Union's mission in Somalia, now the African Union's transition mission in Somalia. The aid kept flowing to Uganda regardless of how many egregious human rights abuses were carried out. But then something changed in February of 2014. That was when Uganda passed the first infamous Anti-Homosexuality Act. This is where some of the controversial stuff comes in. The act mandated life imprisonment for gay sex, 7 years in prison for, quote, attempting to commit homosexuality, and 5 to 7 years in jail and a $4,000 fine for, quote, promotion of homosexuality. The Obama administration decided Uganda needed to be sanctioned, even though it was considered a generous host for refugees and a reliable counterterrorism party in Somalia. After the law was signed, Obama told Museveni that this law would, quote, complicate our valued relationship with Uganda and, quote, be a step backward for all Ugandans and reflect poorly on Uganda's commitment to protect the human rights of its people. Museveni refused to back down, claiming that Western criticism of the law was, quote, an attempt at social imperialism. But here is where Obama went beyond rhetorical condemnation. These were admittedly small steps, but at least they were concrete actions. And we kept hearing all weekend here about action. The Defense Department canceled an aviation exercise with Uganda. The State Department imposed a visa ban on officials involved with corruption and human rights violations against the gay population, a precursor to the Global Magnitsky Act. The Obama administration even planned on, quote, redirecting certain financial support for the Ministry of Health and allocating the $3 million it intended to use for a national public health institute to another African country. It also ended a $2.4 million community policing program for the Uganda police. All of these measures demonstrate that the U.S. can suddenly develop the political will to punish the Museveni regime. If they want, exactly. What happened after that? Museveni stopped objecting to Western social imperialism. And in August 2014, Uganda's constitutional court annulled the anti-homosexuality law. After the law was annulled, Uganda continued with its, quote, normal practice of attacking the political opposition. After the violence around the 2016 election, Human Rights Watch reported that the U.S., quote, raised serious concerns over intimidation and abuse during the elections, but there were no changes to U.S. policy, none. At that point, the U.S. was providing $440 million to Uganda for the health sector and $70 million to Amazon. Torture and abductions every year continued and went on and on. After the 2021 election, State Department Ned Price said the U.S. was concerned, that's what we call rhetorical condemnation, about a lot of issues. Sometimes the U.S. is concerned. Sometimes they are very concerned. They're gravely concerned, and they're deeply concerned. Or they can be troubled, or very troubled, or deeply troubled, right? All rhetorical condemnation. And so that, after the 2020 election, Ned Price said they're concerned about election irregularities and would consider a range of targeted options to hold accountable those members of the security forces responsible for these actions, but nothing happened. So, members of Congress have been more critical of Uganda than the State Department. Does anybody know off the top of your head which members of Congress have been most critical of Uganda? Anybody know? Senator Menendez? Anybody else? Cory Booker. Did someone say that? Okay. Okay, good. Okay. So in 2021, after the election, Senator Booker and Republican Senator Jim Risch, both from the Foreign Relations Committee, sent a joint letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressing their grave concern, but they're not only going to talk about grave concern. Grave concern comes first. Grave concern about the state of democracy and ongoing human rights abuses in Uganda, but they also asked the State Department to review all non-humanitarian assistance to Uganda to ensure that it is not aiding or abetting corruption or human rights abuses. Uganda currently receives around $900 million in bilateral assistance from the U.S. $533 million is from USAID, combating HIV/AIDS, fighting malaria and tuberculosis, very closely monitored. The $100 million is for food, and much of the rest is probably from the Defense Department. This information is classified, so we don't know exactly where it goes and how much it is. However, the U.S. must also approve World Bank funds that go directly to the government of Uganda. And where's Kareem? There he is. I remember I went on a demonstration with you guys, and then we also went to the World Bank. And I didn't really know that much about Uganda at that point. I said, why are we going to the World Bank? And so, but that was the right thing to do, because obviously, I even had a red hat, which I did have, but I was worried it was going to fall off, so I didn't wear it today. But I do have my red hat. So the United States must also approve World Bank funds that go directly to Uganda. This money, in contrast to AID money, is not carefully audited and relatively easy to steal, which I'm sure a lot of you know. So one thing the U.S. could do could be more aggressive in determining how World Bank funds are spent in Uganda, since it's the largest contributor to the bank. So in December 2021, the U.S. did sanction Major General Abel Candido. Joanne already talked about that. But most of what it was doing was still rhetorical condemnation. Now comes the other controversial thing I'm going to talk about. Then came the second anti-homosexuality law, signed into law in May 2023. It is the most severe anti-gay law in the world, even more punitive than the 2014 anti-gay law. Makes acts of homosexuality punishable by up to 20 years in prison, and mandates the death penalty for what is called aggravated homosexuality. Just like Obama did in 2014, this extreme anti-gay law has mobilized the Biden administration and members of Congress to punish the Museveni regime, which I know a lot of you are aware of. Biden said the U.S. may impose sanctions on Uganda and would evaluate the implications of the law, quote, on all aspects of U.S. engagement with Uganda. That's an opening. That's an opening for advocacy in Congress. That one sentence, all aspects of U.S. engagement with Uganda. So what I'm going to be talking about is how can you use the condemnation of this law to expand U.S. condemnation of human rights and torture and corruption in Uganda. That's what I'm going to be arguing. So he also said this could apply to Uganda's eligibility for AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Biden continued. Listen to the words he said. This shameful act is the latest development in an alarming trend of human rights abuses and corruption in Uganda. I'm going to say it again. Biden said this shameful act, the Anti-Gay Act, is the latest development in an alarming trend of human rights abuses and corruption in Uganda. If he had not condemned the anti-gay law, he would not be talking about the other human rights abuses and corruption, right? So what's important for people to do is not just say, oh, they only talk about the anti-gay law. How can you use that to get the administration and Congress to expand their criticism of Uganda in every different way? Oh, thank you. I'm glad some people support that, because I knew this is a little bit of a touchy issue. Okay, so Museveni claims that Western countries are exporting their values to Uganda and that the anti-gay law reflects genuine Ugandan values. But what has actually happened in the last 20 years is that right-wing evangelical Christians in the United States, the same people whose friends might have stormed the US Capitol in 2021, 15 minutes from my house, they have targeted Uganda as ripe for the picking. According to the well-respected Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I have 2 copies of this article here, if anybody wants to take a look at it. It's a very respected organization. What they said is that these extremist so-called American Christians decided to focus their anti-gay agenda on Uganda. They picked Uganda out of all the African countries. From 2007 to 2020, over 20 evangelical groups spent at least $54 million in Africa to influence, quote, law, policies, and public opinion on birth control, reproductive rights, and an anti-gay agenda. Nearly half was spent in one country, Uganda. Did anybody know this? So you can read this article. I only brought 2, but it's called It's called The Unholy Relationship Between Uganda's Anti-LGBTQ Law and U.S. Evangelicalism. You can just go to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, put in Unholy Relationship, and you'll find it. Karim, you were reading it. It's a good article, right? He has to say yes. Okay, so then in 2009, top American evangelical leaders organized a 3-day conference in Kampala to expose the homosexual agenda. That is when they laid the groundwork for the 2014. Okay. I'm almost done. The groundwork was laid for the 2014 anti-gay law. So this came from America. Those are American cultural extremists who were coming to Uganda. The last thing I want to talk about very, very briefly, and this is important, this is an amendment to something called the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. And 2 members of Congress proposed this amendment. It didn't pass, but I want to summarize it very quickly what it is, because this is the direction I recommend that people go. So the amendment says, from Congressman Bob Garcia and Congresswoman Becca Balint, all funds to Uganda should be cut, all funds should be cut, including assistance in the form of equipment and training to coordinate joint training exercises, until the Secretary of State certifies that Uganda has taken 4 actions. So this is calling for a real aid cut. It's going beyond rhetorical condemnation. No more money for military assistance until Uganda investigates and prosecutes members of the UPDF who have violated human rights, until they establish that now neither the police or the UPDF are persecuting LGBT people. This is part of the package. It's part of the package. Next, establish that the police and the UPDF are protecting the rights of trade unionists, journalists, human rights defenders, critics of the government, faith and religious leaders, and other civil society activists. And that guarantees that judicial system investigates, prosecutes, and brings to justice members of the police and the military who have committed human rights abuses. So my last sentence is, I see 2 ways to have an impact in Congress. One is this incredible film that we saw last night, of course, to get it around to the public, to students, to Congress. And the other is to encourage members of Congress to not criticize them for attacking the anti-gay law, but say we want to build on it and expand it so that you condemn all human rights abuses and corruption in Uganda and take action to cut military aid. Oh, that's it. I don't know who's next.
Awo nno we tuli. Tuli mu ggwanga lya America, Washington, D.C. Mu lukuŋŋaana lwa National Platform NUP Convention 2023. Baabo obafunye bulungi abalwanirizi ba ddembe ate bannamateeka bakuukuutivu baasoma ebitabo ne babikuguka era baabikenkukamu. Ate ekikwatagana ne Uganda eddembe ly'obuntu erityobolebwa babimanyi bulungi, babikuba budinda, babikuba bukusu. Babikenkuka era babitegeera. Abaagala babeewo ekikolebwa okulaba nga gavumenti ya Mwami Museveni ekola ebikolobero ku bannayuganda okutulugunya n'ebirala. Wabaako ekimukolebwako. Bagala omusango gwatwaliddwa mu kkooti y'ensi yonna guveemu ebibala balabe nga Mwami Museveni one day bamukutte Jake nga Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine bw'akyogera bulijjo nti mbyogera wano ng'ebyokusaaga naye mugenda kulaba one day nga Mwami Museveni bamubase Jake nga buli waagenda nga bamubakirayo Jake era ajja kubeera mu Uganda mpozi ate nga talina na nsimbi kuba banka y'ensi yonna ensimbi yazimusazeeko. Awo kiba kitegeeza nti ebyo bikomye mugenda kulaba gavumenti weebwe ennume y'ekigo nze ate awo Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine ndayire. Bino nno byongera okuwekeninga oba byongera okunafuya gavumenti ya Mwami Museveni. Bino byaliwo okko ne ku mulembe gwa Idi Amin Dada bwe yali yeefudde ennaggwano abazungu batandika omusalako ensimbi ze baali bamuwa bw'atyo n'asigala ng'ali yala yamaliriza gavumenti yeegudde. Mwami Museveni simanyi ye weeneekoma weeneegwira naye kino ekigenda mu maaso mugenda kukiwulira. Bannayuganda mujja kumanya nti nno Kyagulanyi yajja nnyo yajja ssebo. Abinaze abisuubiza nti Mwami Museveni walina okubaawo ekimukolebwako ekyenjawulo nga bamu bagamba nti oyo yalema. Kati nno agenda abaprovinga wrong nti nno ye bye yasuubiza bye yayogera nti ajja bituukiriza abituukiriza. Akyayongera okufeffetta agenda buli wali akasuwa Mwami Museveni akabadde kamuvujjirira akabadde kamuwa otusaaye okusigala nga waali n'okusigala nga w'amaanyi nga obusuwa busala. Kati abazungu abalaba bano balabye naawe obyewuliriddeko ebigambo byabwe babyogedde nga basuubiza nti okutulugunyaza kw'abantu okuli mu ggwanga lya Uganda kususse obw'omulamuzi. Era bamaze ebbanga ddene emyaka mingi okuva biwulidde nga babittottola nga bajja banoonyereza ku bikolobero ebikolebwa ku bannayuganda era ne bakola za lipoota ez'enjawulo. Kati nno baagala pulezidenti wa America Joe Biden abeeko kyakola mu ngeri ey'enjawulo era nga bagenda kusindikiriza bino. Alipooti zonna bagenda kuzimutuusaako okwongera okuzimwanjulira n'okwongera okumujjukiza nti gwe waayo vaawo omuntu gw'okolagana naye akola bino na bino ABCD n'olwekyo osazizaamu ddala enkolaganayo n'oyo omuntu nti enkolagana ya America erina kuba wakati wa bannayuganda ne bannaamerika so si wakati wa America ne Mwami Museveni. Nti ebintu bingi ebikolebwa wakati wa America ne Mwami Museveni nga bannayuganda tebibagasa n'olwekyo baagala kino kikyuke era nga baagala sanctions zeeyongere ziteekebwe ku Mwami Museveni n'ensimbi ezibadde zikyamuweebwa America mu by'okuyamba eby'enjawulo simanya kulwanyisa batujju simanya ba Al-Shabaab baagala byonna bikome kubanga Mwami Museveni ensimbi zino mbu azikozesa bubi. Kati naawe namusebe tuuse ku nnyoge kuba abazungu bwe bavaayo ne beetabira ddala mu lutalo luno Mwami Museveni mba simanyi wagenda kunywa tuzi kuba ebbanga ddene libadde litambula nga liyitawo nga bannayuganda boogera nti lwagezaako okupushinga ensonga ez'enjawulo eyo mu mawanga g'abazungu ate waliyo abazungu Mwami Museveni mbu be yateekayo abamukolera omulimo gw'okulongoosa erinnya lye. Ngabaawo obuvuzibu bwonna obuvuyo bwonna obadde mu Uganda ne bagezaako okulopa ku international scene ng'abazungu bafuuyirira akanwe kagalo nga balongoosa erinnya Mwami Museveni nga bawakana nga basimba n'ennakakongo nga bakombera ddala kwerima nga bakomba ku paasi nti ebyo bya bulimba bya buwaayiriza byali byadda bya mulembe gwa Amin babigasegase ne babiteeka ku Museveni tannaba kubikolako. Kati nno obujulizi bwongera kuvaayo bagamba baagala kwongera kulabisa na kulaga kkooti ya nsi yonna nti ekiri e Uganda kika ekiri e Uganda temujjereere ekiri e Uganda kisaana kutereeza era nga baagala Mwami Museveni jeekeerume. Byonna tujja kubiraba byonna tubirinde ffe amaaso ku lutimbe. Kyagulanyi agambye ey'ogwo omupiira yagweyama era ajja kuguzannya bw'anaamala okusala emisuwa gyonna egya Mwami Museveni gy'abadde ajja akasimbi ate olwo omupiira aguteere mu bannayuganda gusigale nga guli wamu kubanga Mwami Museveni ajja kuba kyalina nsimbi zigula masasi zigula tiyagaasi zigula tanka kiba kitegeeza ajja kuba mwangu nnyo okujja ku ntebe muba mulina kukola gwammwe amasasi agakube gamuggweko ate awo atulabira abeewaabwe. Bigambo bya Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine byayongera okusuubiza bannayuganda buli olukya era nga kukyowulidde ebigambo by'abazungu bano bakyeruppe bye boogedde naawe olinamu essuubi ly'ofuna nti nno ewama waliwo ekijja very soon. Kale mbebaza nnyo mwenna abaddeko bannayuganda mwenna bazze mu convention eno ya 2023 wano Washington DC tubeebaza mwebale kwagala nsi yammwe mwebale kwettanira era mwebale kubaawo. Nebaza omukulembeze Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine ne bwe yatambudde n'abakapaalami n'abakulembeze ab'enjawulo okuba nti ensonga eno ebadde nsufu bweti okuba nti obubaka butuuse. Nebaza buli eyeetabyemu buli alina kyakoze nti oli wa boda oli wa mulembe Omukama yaba okutuweera ebirungi ate tulabe ku Uganda empya ng'eteredde nga ffenna tuvimba. Mbaagala nnyo mwenna abaliko abateekako kaddata ne mulaba ababeerawo ne muwayo akadde kammwe mwebale kujjanga kufuna mawulire gagenda mu maaso mu nsi yaffe era nange mbaagala Omukama nsaba bankuumire banywanyi tujja kuba tuddamu tuwaye ng'ate nkomyewo n'ebirala bingi tukyali e Washington DC byonna ngenda kubyeta ngenda bibawa mwe mulindirire bulindirizi Katonda nsaba bankuumire mweraba.